Hello folks, and thank you for tuning into this video. In today's episode I'm going to be covering literature reviews. Now, as I said in my shorter briefing video, regardless of if you're an undergraduate, a master's student or a PhD student, this video is going to be covering the breadth of what is covered in literature reviews, sharing with you some of my tips and strategies that I've explored throughout my various degrees, and also sharing with you some tools that I've used to really help out. Now, first of all, if you're looking at your master's project, your undergraduate project, you may be coming up with that topic idea. So first of all, your first point of call is really developing those research questions. Now, as I explained in the previous video, those research questions are what you need to really set the tone and direction of your project. They tell you your aims and objectives. Do go and explore that video for more tips on developing that research question. But once you've got that research question in mind, first of all, when you're approaching a literature review, you start off with looking at what literature is already out there. So that's a deep dive into literature to begin with. Once you've done that first deep dive into that research content, you're looking at key search terms. Now, for those of you who haven't used sites such as Google Scholar or Microsoft Academic, your first thing that you're looking for is really how to effectively use that search. Now, you might have covered this in your assignments, but if you haven't, so using Boolean key search terms, so those and, not, or, as well as using those key search enhancers. So when you're looking through those keywords and you're trying to piece together what elements of those academic structures really come out and what literature you're looking for. Now, for me, I always start off with limiting my search to the most recent 5 years of publications. So when I'm looking at Google Scholar or my own university's library search engine, those are the first places that I start with. Now, if you haven't got a great range of content, expand those years of publication and go a bit wider. But when you're looking at journal publications, at least to start with, you should give yourself a date range to look for. So for me, it's 5 years. You might come up with your own, but that would be my recommendation. Now, once you've got those, so journals are really where you should start, and you're looking at what are their general approaches that they're taking. Have they got a particular academic aim that they're looking at? Do they use a particular methodology? What context is that methodology used in? Is it a particular systematic approach? Is it the size of the sample that they're using? Is that related to your project? Now, undergraduate, master's students, you might not have the full scope of your project or what's available or feasible for you. PhD students, you're more likely to have that later on. Your supervisors will be able to inform you incentives you have for human studies if you're going to use incentives to entice someone to participate. If you might have available lab animals or crops that you can use for further study, or data that you can access because that's what your universities pay for. So those are all questions that you'll have to ask regardless of the level, but PhD students, it might already be set up and thought about in place for you. So do have that conversation with your supervisors. Now, once you have a bit more of that idea, you can start thinking to yourself, okay, so I know the type of methods that, or the type of range of samples I can use. So I'm now going to have that conversation with myself and my supervisors to think what methodology I want to approach or want to use. So those conversations should be: what type of sample are you using? What type of study are you going to use? A qualitative study where you're looking at more of the contextual reasons, the reasons why, the whys, the broader elements such as human interviews or study of individual subjects, or you're looking at the breadth of differences between a larger sample, your quantitative data where you're looking at very fixed measures, whereas your qualitative looks at more abstract measures, and which is really going to be relevant to your study. So for my master's and my undergrad, I used quantitative data. One was looking at dogs as a subject and looking at health and safety metrics and measures. My master's degree looked at quantitative surveying techniques using human stress indicators and staff perception of those stresses. My PhD, however, is far more qualitative, looking at interviews and sampling individual studies using different types of interview techniques and different roadmaps to effectively identify what individual perceptions of different questions or their different approaches to their own interactions with different stimulus. Now, those are my particular academic projects and how they've looked. But when you look at qualitative or quantitative methods in your literature, that should be really the base set that you're looking at for. Okay, what have other people done in this study? So, what has been their approach? What has been what is that level of understanding or investigation of that gap done for them? Has that approach been successful, or did they find it didn't work? So when you're starting out, that early point of looking at other people's methodology will really help you decide what approach to go down and really which papers are going to form the basis of your study. Now, outside of looking at that general methodology, once you've got a more overview of the literature, you've done a fair bit of a deep dive into the general research area you want to explore, you've identified some of the gaps that are available and where some of the areas where you want to do more work in and look at that study. So you potentially looked at the gaps that are already there, you've looked at the methodology that someone else has used to approach that, you've come up with your own methods or your own approaches to that, or you've used their versions as well. After that, you're looking for what other research is going to support, or whether that is supporting the existing research you've been looking at, or it's going to contradict that research. So you then try and look for keywords in relation to your area. Now, one of the benefits with the advancements of new AI tools, so artificial intelligence tools, ChatGPT and WriteSonic are fantastic, useful resources for looking for those keyword searches. So using common terms that are within your that field, taking those common phrases or titles and saying to it, what are some of the keywords that are used in this particular title or areas of work in, say, neurology or human genetics or genetics in general, and you're looking for those key terms that that program can generate, and then taking those keywords and trying a variation of those search terms to develop more literature for yourself. So once you've got that literature, once you've got those key search terms, making a note of those different terms, search terms that you're using, what they've produced for you, and how that fits in with your wider project. Does it conform with your research question? Does it make you question that research question? And are you going to change those aims and objectives as a result of some of those searches? Is there areas, if there's an area that stands out to you that really goes against what the approach you're taking, then don't necessarily disregard the paper, challenge it, evaluate it, critically review it, and use that to provide that context for why you've approached your study in the way that you have approached your study, and use that to reinforce your position or to suggest to the reader, your examiner, your researcher, co-researchers or supervisors, why you've taken that approach that you have. For a PhD student in particular, this is going to help with your ESAs or your late stage reviews. Those type of things are going to help answer your examiner's questions before they have to ask you directly with vivas and so on. If you're an undergrad or a master's student, setting those conversations out in your literature review gives them a context to show that you've thought about that approach. Now, for me, you get far more of that support in your writing and in that general structure from PhD supervisors and at a PhD level. So for that, I'm trying to give you just some of my benefits of my experience that try and take that approach on very early and try and formulate those conversations in that discussion, both within the literature review that you do before your project that forms the basis and the foundation, and that then reinforces and supports your discussion. So the elements that you're going to take forward to then reevaluate with your results. So when you get to this stage, so then it's looking at, for example, once you've got a more broader context, then you might want to be looking at, okay, so I've got my broad context. Now I want to do more of a deep dive into particular areas because you've got a particular area you want to explore, or you've got results or preliminary studies that you've already started off and you want to explore that in more detail. So then be more specific to that particular area that you're looking for. So for example, for my study at the moment, it's looking at how parents or mentor figures have supported particular academics and their academic decisions that then influence their career. So with that in mind, I will be looking at areas that what indicators parental support or parental influence has on academic success. And those are the contexts that I'll be taking through from different readings, different research I'll be doing. The other thing to look at is the breadth of the resources that you've got. So journals are fantastic resources, but they are also, the process of getting a peer review paper and publication does take time. Books are more of an author's window into that literature. It's more of an opinionated piece than what a journal might be. So bear that in mind when you're reviewing that context. Now, if you're reviewing websites and magazines normally form a coalition of different papers that have been put together, and they become a collage of their readers' interest. So regardless of if that website is a highly developed individual business or publication that is more focused on one individual, or whether it's a magazine piece that is a representation of industry. All of those type of contexts will come into an element of bias. Because they have an element of bias to them, you've just got to bear in mind that when you're taking that into account. The same as an author's window into their research is going to be more skewed in a book potentially than it will be in a journal, because the journal is more deep dive into the research itself, the context of that. The book might be more opinionated to a particular narrative that the author wants to show you, and that's something you just have to bear in mind. Now, if you're looking at how you take those into account, just try and take a range of that. Form the bulk of that work through the journals, but then use websites and magazines to really explore current events, and use books to take a deep dive into a particular theory that you're interested in and how they've come up with that idea, the more personable reasons that they've come up with that theory and what that's shown and how that's been used. Do bear in mind with magazines, websites and books, it will be marketed, it will be skewed because it's marketed, it's promoted. Journals don't have that same skew, but they will also have funders who might bias that. And do remember to look at the subtext of a journal to see if it's the funders have had any influence or any effect on what their motivation for doing that piece is. Now, in terms of other tools to use, if you publish any of your work or you've looked at a particular part before, do remember to use plagiarism checkers such as Grammarly, just in case you are worried that an abstract that you published might be potential at risk of self-plagiarization because you've presented part of that work at a study or part of that study's work at a conference. You don't want to fall into the trap of potentially self-plagiarizing your own work. So do ideally try to research a completely different thing for that is adjacent to your project, but do just bear that in mind. And then when you're putting this into a context and you're structuring it, the other thing to help you out and support you is using concept mapping tools. Again, something I've explored in other videos before, but a concept map similar to a mind map, but the concept map is those links between those different journal publications, what they've said, why they've said it, what common themes that you're able to see in that, and you're using that element of thematic analysis where you're looking at what are those common emerging themes and contexts of their work. Where do they have similar methodology? Where do they differ? Why do they differ? And using that to have conversations within that map to really explore those individual perspectives. Now, that is something I've used to a high degree when exploring my three sub-research research questions in my PhD, and comparing that to my overarching question and seeing what papers particularly answer or address a certain element of that sub-question. Why do they answer that question but not that? Where do they cross over? Where don't they cross over? And what are those relationships that are taking place? I very much took the approach of the concept map is more my living evidence of my thought process and my development of those ideas, whereas my effectively my mind map was my very early brain waves that I was having in terms of what research areas I wanted to look at, why I wanted to address that particular area, was there an area that I wanted to park for further study, why did I want to leave it in that area? Are there conversations that I've had with my supervisors that I've thought, oh yeah, this is a really interesting area, but I'm not going to be able to have time to explore it, or it's not reasonable or practical to explore it in this particular context. Now, in this, what I'm going to do with this video is, because this covers such a breadth of the topic, in the next video I'm going to cover a core element that really reinforces what goes into your literature review and that early part of your formative writing when you're developing that, which is your ethics form. And then what I'm going to do is cover some of the elements that I've mentioned in more detail, and literature reviews in a broader context at a later point after covering that ethics review video so the ethics paperwork that you will complete as a undergrad, a master's, or a PhD student. I'll cover those elements, then go into the broader context of how to generally outline, structure that literature review, taking those deep dives and what to look for, so to really give you more of that information once the wider, broader context has been explored, so it gives you that support. So thank you very much for listening to effectively what will be part one of the literature review video and deep dive, and be sure to tune in next week for the ethics paperwork and approaching scientific ethics, and we'll come back to literature reviews at a later point. Thank you again for tuning in and watching this episode, and good luck with all your research. Bye.